Hey, welcome everybody. This is season 1, episode 15 of Bridging Generations with Howard Snooks. I am Howard, and today I have a really cool guy. His name is Luke Hanley, and I've known him, what would you say, about a year or less?
About a year.
It's been about a year. And we've had lunch together. We've had some fun conversations, and I thought, okay, this guy, he's really smart and he has ideas about everything. and we're just really going to have a fun conversation. But I always start with the dad joke. And my dad joke today has to do with Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris was such a good navigator that self-driving cars would ask him for directions.
Love it. Love it.
Okay, that's how I always start out because a dad joke. Because, I'm old enough. This is the whole Bridging Generations thing.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to be your father. Yeah. I don't know exactly how old you are, but I'm sure that I am.
Yeah. So, Luke Hanley, so happy to be here. So glad you're doing this, Howard. This is like knowing you and getting to know you over the past year. I'm like, oh, this is a perfect fit. I can't wait to dig deeper into the discology of your podcast route here because always something good to say and always very thought-provoking. So very happy to be here. And
great.
From an age side is I'm in that cusp of grew up analog and digital. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a really unique space on the fact of how many, all the development, the movement of, social mores has happened really in lockstep with the growth of technology. And we're at a absolutely pivotal time. We've never been in a time like this. I don't know how you feel about it.
But. Well, overwhelmed, I would say it happens sometimes to me. But I go, I can get through this. I mean, I just sort of say it like that, and people will help me out. If I get in trouble, they'll help me out. And people are pretty patient when you're an old geezer. I mean, I'm sure there are people that are muttering under their breath, but they act pretty nice, when they get confused.
Yeah. People like to help.
They like to help.
They like to help. I think kindness goes a long way in how we approach that. But I mean, I find it in my work daily. Like there's always someone younger than me. There's always something that I can learn. And I think across, whether you go up in age or you go down in age, there's always a different perspective. And that's added data points that allows me to look at and understand other people more and how they operate and, how to work with folks.
Well, my reason for doing this was there's these sort of stereotypes like, okay, boomer, that sort of condescending thing. Yeah. And there's also like, you young scalawag, you don't know what you're doing and get off my lawn. There's that sort of, and you can see that sometimes. So my idea is just like, well, how do we explore people who have made a difference in someone's life? Mm-hmm. And I've had mentors that are younger than I, and I've had mentors that are older than I. And one of the things I'm going to ask you is, who's helped you along your way? That'll be one of the things. And you told me about a couple of them, these kind of old boulder dudes. Yeah. And I think that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
But I'm going to turn it over to you to just give us a précis about your life, just sort of like where you're from, children, just that sort of those basic things.
I'll try and consolidate a lot into a little. Grew up in the Northeast. 7th or 8th generation Mainer. One side, mom.
A Downeaster.
A Downeaster. That's yes, sir. Downeaster. And mom from the Midwest. So grew up.
She married into this old Maine
She
family.
married into. I mean, they say in Maine, finding a guy there, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. Is very true.
Bert and I.
Yeah. I mean, I think about it like a peninsula or more like an island up there in the U.S. as it, has its own culture, but. Grew up on the Northeast. I got into Russian in high school and really Russian literature at first. I think angsty teenagers looking at Dostoevsky and Notes from the Underground and a lot of this stuff, trying to wrestle with the
Okay, hold it right there.
Yeah, hold on.
How did you get into Russian in high school in Maine?
Well, I'm an 80s kid. So, it's really interesting, and I'll kind of pin back around on this, but growing up in the 80s, the Cold War for us was like Rocky IV, Spies Like Us. I mean, they're Ruskies, all of this stuff, and the idea of, either being a Secret Service or working in one of those areas was really appealing. And this idea of like, I had that very much G.I. Joe, good guy, bad guy perspective. I was also fairly conservative growing up. So, I'd gotten into that and then came into the literature side of it and then the Russian language, and was over in Russia in 95, setting up computer systems when I was 15 years old. In the wintertime.
I didn't know this about you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Huh.
So we, guy Jim Landier, I believe was his name, he worked with us to write a grant called Linking Schools Through Technology.
Okay.
And we went over and set up an internet system in Russia. And one of the things that I thought was really life-changing for me was I saw how I grew up with the Cold War as like entertainment. Like it was so distant. It was on a screen over here. It was Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase, This was a very different world of what the Cold War is. And then seeing how they were living, I remember just showing up in this town of Tver, and there's these communist style apartment buildings, and the hallways smelled like bread yeast and cat urine and the F word misspelt in 5 different ways around all the buildings and hallways. And it was wintertime. It's about 200 miles northwest of Moscow.
Oh, that was my
January,
next question. Okay.
Which is a delightful, not on your like travel list to go for January, but there were these kids sledding on a hill, sort of in the center of these large communist style, sort of horseshoe design. And I was like,
they're having fun.
They're having fun.
Yeah.
Now, they were sledding on the bomb shelter that was outside for the apartments. I was like, they grew up thinking the Americans could bomb at any moment and real threat. And I think, from a generational perspective, I think about, when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, that felt, I'm imagining, as like a real threat that was taking place.
Duck and cover.
Yeah. I mean, it was really tight. Whereas, I feel pretty privileged to grow up in that time period prior to 9/11. We were a bit ignorant to that thought of threat. The Vietnam War is like everybody had an uncle or a dad or somebody, and that was a thing. But outside of, and maybe grandparents who fought in World War II or Korea, but we, didn't really have that.
So you were born in 1980?
1980.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. And so, I came out, I dropped out of school in Boston, went out to Alaska, made my way down. I was in Taos, New Mexico, living in an Earthship when I was 20, which is,
I love that.
Oh, I loved, I was so into.
Taos is one of my favorite places in the world.
Yeah. It was a beautiful area. I wanted a place where I could ski, but also that had culture. And, I remember coming into that town and, I'd been working up at the Yellowstone Club, which was amazing skiing. I had left, taken off early from that season and went down south, and Taos was still open. They got about 16 inches of snow. It was a bluebird day. I spent the night at the Alley Cantina during a Native American film festival. Had such a good time, and I was like, I'm just going to stay here. This is like, if Taos likes you, Taos keeps you. And
well, that's a very close community in Taos.
Very close. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff. Lots of interesting stories. And most of my friends were all in school and pushing through, and so that was. At that time, the idea of not going to college was like unheard of, right?
Well, yeah, I want to stop you here for a minute because please. You're telling me. And then I found myself in Russia. And then, I was in Boston going to college, but I dropped out and I went here as if it sort of all happened to you, like you were placed there. But you actually were directing your life, and you were going in these sort of ways that probably a typical Maine down east guy would not be doing.
Yeah.
And what possessed you? What
I think, to go back to that Russian literature, there's that restless soul, right? And I think, our paths are, I would love to take credit for the things that I've done in my life. And yet at the same time, I think about it almost more like a Forest Gump. You just sort of show up and you just keep showing up and you keep being present in where you're at. And you're like, this feels good. This feels like the right place to be. And then when it doesn't, you either make the decision to move or the decision is made for you and life happens. And, I ended up coming back up from Taos. I came to, it's a whole other stint where a buddy and I bought 1936 46-foot gaff rig schooner in northern Maine. Had a whole crazy adventure with that. And then after all that stuff, a schooner. Wow, there's a lot of good things about a full keel boat. We don't have to go into the sailing world too hard, but the ability to heave to in a storm, that sort of soft sound of that, the wood on the hull, that was a wild time. And I'll share one story from that, not to go too long. Okay. But Buddy and I ended up finding this boat, and it already had a buyer. This guy, Jean-Paul. And Jean-Paul was from Montreal. We were up in Morgan Bay in Surrey, Maine. And, we offered him more money than this guy had paid. He was going to come pick it up in the spring. And we're like, well, we'll give you a little extra if you'll sell it to us right now. And he's like, okay, do it. Now, fast forward to 6 months down the road, we had sailed down. We had to pull the boat out in Virginia. We had sailed out to Bermuda. We're caught in Bermuda waiting for parts in the boat in St. George in the harbor. And there was a storm coming in. And we had gone up on the dock there. And, we have our spring lines and bumpers and the waves and the wind, and we're adjusting through the night. Well, in the middle of the night, this brand new 47-foot Beneteau shows up right in front of us. And we get out in the morning, and this guy gets out. He sees we're wet. I've got my dog, on the boat.
Of course, you got to have your dog.
On the boat. Yeah, as you do.
Yeah.
And so the guy comes over and he starts going, He's like, He's like, you're the guys. And we're like, what? First thing in the morning, it's been a rough night. We've been out. This guy's yelling at us. We're trying to get our terrible coffee down and he's like, that's the flying fish. You're the people who bought the boat out from underneath me.
Oh my God.
He was transporting a boat for someone from France to, Florida, the Keys, somewhere down there. The storm hit. He ended up having to call Pan, which is one level below Mayday, like boats going down. Pan is like, hey, bring us into port. And just with that storm, he ended up stopping in Bermuda. He never would have stopped across 3,000 miles of ocean. Would not have stopped. Ends up getting put into the port, getting brought in right in front of us. And,
fate had something to...
It's the Forest Gump, it just kind of happens. And so he ended up getting the boat back and buying, and the story kind of ends from there. But to the whole how life happens, it seems a lot more in line with that. I would never have so much pride or ego to say that I, had anything. I view myself more as like a spirit having a human experience versus a human searching for spiritual experience.
Okay, you said that very well, because I was searching for how to describe you, and that hits it on the button.
Oh, thanks.
Well, okay, so there's this word in Spanish called miedo. And it means fear, but it's a specific kind of fear. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure you have known the feeling of fear, but fear doesn't drive you. Anxiety doesn't drive you, I would say. That you, like, if you find yourself Forest Gump wise, you go, well, what do we got going on here? Is that kind of right?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I think, I got into rock climbing early on in my career, and I'm actually very afraid of heights, and that always surprises people. Being like, well, why would you? It's just like, why would you do this if you're afraid of heights? And it's pushing against the fear, right? Yeah. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's just you learn to tune it out and recognize it. And that recognition and understanding helps me at least bypass around a lot of that. But I feel like the things that drive me, it's each day getting to be challenged for something that if I can solve, I can do something. And, do I have fear? I definitely do. I just don't think about it. And that training kind of helps, I think, from climbing in that world.
Well, here's where my therapy background comes in. It's called Counter-Phobia.
Yeah.
That's the name for it. And it's a really effective defense for people. People think of defenses as, well, you shouldn't have defenses, but actually defenses are just like the perspective you put on the world. It's not really like you're defending against overwhelming fear, let's say. Well, you've developed a very nice strategy to deal with overwhelming fear.
Yeah.
And you found that it helps you, like it fits your personality, it fits you.
Yeah.
And so some of that is nature and some of that is nurture. And I don't know how that formula comes up with you, but one of my goals here is to learn about people who've had an influence upon you. And I just wonder if this being able to effectively use Counter-Phobia has some sort of source.
It's interesting. So my dad is an engineer. So, that, and a lot of the context of what you would say when you think about engineers and how they think about things. And he was also deep into Stephen Covey and 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which in high school, when I was a hooligan and would get in trouble, it'd be like, Luke, we have a serious habit number 5 we need to speak about tonight. And I was a little shit and be like, well, Dad, I feel like you're being a bit more reactive. And I think we need to talk about circle of influence versus circle of concern, because if we're going to get through it, he's like, you are using the language that I taught you
just like
to just turn.
He wanted to strangle you.
He wanted to murder me.
Yeah.
But he was such a amazing public speaker.
Interesting.
And I always, when I would see him speak, and usually it was, they were in the church as, an order, or at a funeral or a wedding, these types of events. And he was just so good. And people would always come up to me afterwards and say, wow, your dad's an amazing public speaker. He could be a politician or a priest. He's too honest to be a politician. And my mom was just, she's kind of very all heart. She's got that piece where she connects with you. When she's there, you could tell she's there and she's present with you. And so I was fortunate to get both of those things. And then my brother-in-law, who, he and my sister have been together since I was 3 or 4 years old, like high school sweethearts, forever. He and I worked together, and I saw the way that he operated too. And I was like, man, he was so good. He was so good. And so I just wanted to be these people. And so, I sort of created this idea of what life I wanted to have. I eventually had a family and identical twin girls, moved up to the mountains, retired a bit early and went up. I was, in my early 30s, and I kind of, hit a bit of a wall, because I was like, I had this goal of this person I wanted to be.
Well, could you be a little more specific about your brother-in-law? He was good, you said, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about
there was never a situation that he wasn't just spot on, just perfect. And so we worked together.
He knew what to do in all situations.
He always knew what to do. He always knew what to say. He always and it was a fascinating way to look at things and to look into that world. Because I'd gone from, being with my dog in the Earthship in the desert with a man bun to all of a sudden, playing this role as businessman. And I'm like dressing up and going in and I would be so nervous when I started off on that because I would have to carry like an extra shirt because I would sweat through my shirt on the way to go because I was so nervous. And, afterwards I would talk to people and I was like, man, I must have come across incredibly nervous. Like, no, you didn't look nervous at all. And I was like, I was dying inside. And I realized that, and I think this is the transition of focused on self to being aware that everyone else around you is also experiencing life, also thinks that they are in their own show that this is going through, and realizing that, we're all so similar. And even if it's like age difference, if it's political difference, if it's whatever it is, we all care about the same things and worry about the same things. We all care about our kids and our parents and our families and our health. We all care about our schools and we care about our town, that, these things are core across pretty much everywhere. Where we've gotten lost, I think, is in how we get there or how we approach those things we care about. And I think, if we pull back in how I operate in my life now, because I work between very different worlds. Yeah. And I have to be a bit agnostic. I always look at and communicate with people from a perspective of we care about the same things. And focusing at that as the foundational piece, then you could start talking about what the design is, how it needs to look. But
I got to ask you a question about this. Because you're also an opinionated person. You're an opinionated person who's an agnostic. And so there's kind of a contradictory piece to that. And people are contradictory. I mean, that's something I know about people. It's not like people have a bottom line. And so I just want to hear, though, how you have managed to wend your way through this.
Smiling.
Well, you're a good smiler. You're a good smiler.
Goes like, there was a thing I'd always call this, like, Bogart style, or, you'd watch old movies. And I always loved like black and white movies growing up. Loved old. I mean, I'm a big Twilight Zone, Rod Sterling. Loved these, love it. And I found that in some of these old movies, people would say very, let's say, comments that have a little bit of friction on them, but they would say it in a smile and connect it. And somehow it just seems to work. And I've really incorporated that into my entire life as a way of communicating with people and having opinions, while also, sprinkling in a bit of like, hey, I'm here with you. We're here. Maybe this isn't the right thing, but this is kind of the perspective on it, and it's coming from a good-natured place.
Well, it makes me think, this is what it makes me think of, is just Republicans and Democrats. My father was from this old, diehard Republican family. My mother was from Democratic family. That, like, my great-great-grandfather was one of the very first state legislators in Colorado as a Democrat. Yeah. And somehow they loved each other. They loved to talk politics, but it worked somehow. Yeah. And my in-laws, their in-laws, my mother's parents and my dad's parents, they were good friends, but they were very different.
And so what do you think has changed? Why is it so hard for, the two sides to see eye to eye? Why, from your perspective, what do you think's amiss there?
Well, I think that it's probably a move away from your position that we're all in this together. I think that we are all the same deep inside. It's like, it's a, what do they call it? Tribalism, I think is what it's called. When that's that tribe and this is this tribe. Yeah. I think that's what's happened. And I have someone in mind to blame for this, but I'm not going to say what it is, because it's not like that person caused everything, but he's riding the surf.
I think contextually people pick up on that. Yeah.
Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to bring up that I was thinking of. It's about the Twilight Zone. My favorite show on this was, this guy was, he was on death row. Mm-hmm. He was due to be, electrocuted, I think. And he kept saying to everybody, listen, you guys, you're in my dream. If I go, you all go.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that?
I do.
And they're going, oh, yeah. Well, too bad, but you're going. We're safe. Yeah. And of course, the electricity courses through them and the screen turns blank.
Yeah. I mean, what was beautiful about that is the short story form of that, right? I mean, I always say Roald Dahl had a book, great short works of Roald Dahl.
Roald Dahl.
Amazing short story writer. And his adult stuff is great. And it's very much in line. I mean, I think, he might have pulled some stuff from Rod Serling, the Mr. Brannigan and some of that pulls in with some of the stories there where you could see he definitely got influence. But short story form, and with that twist at the end, that little hook, you get invested in the character, which is hard in very few words. You follow an arc, and then you wait. You don't know what it's going to be at the end. And what a fascinating that the trajectory within the trajectory is like the beautiful. It's like this is from a wordsmithing, to brushstroke. That's just a beautiful line.
Okay, so I'm learning something about you right now. I've known you were really smart, but I didn't really think of you as an intellectual per se. But now I'm starting to think of you as an intellectual. Do you ever think of yourself that way?
I've made a change. It's interesting, right? Because I've been in Boulder for over 20 years now. And, I'm the CEO and founder of this company. And it's very high level in what we do. And so I exist in that world. And so it's interesting that I, with a lot of this newer community, certainly with like the City Club and events, is, people, they know me from that because that's what I do all day, and yet the part that feeds me more is that creative space and trying to think about and understand, trying to always draw connections, right? The brain wants to connect.
Patterns.
It just wants to find patterns. When I hear you talking sort of the difference between, the political parties and how it's gone more tribal, I think about that as like the rise of tattoos. Isn't it interesting that we are, as we get kind of less face-to-face, certainly like post-pandemic, as we move apart while also being more connected. And there's a caveat there. That connection is what we want to project. It is not necessarily who we are. And, I don't think that's terribly bad. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having aspirational self. It's just when you start believing your own story in that's when you really fuck yourself pretty hard and get in a difficult position. I'd say from my own personal experience. But I do think that we are now, with that process, I think people are trying to differentiate and collect themselves so that they recognize like. And I'm gonna wear the uniform. We're on the same side here. And I think there's also a whole. If we talk about it from like a fashion sense and the idea of how a lot of military designs came into fashion, and we see it in like different bits. and
Epaulets.
Yeah,
That's what you're.
Yeah, that's exactly.
That's
Thank you for the word. I'm like, what do they call that? All of these things are. It's about how people want to be seen, and I think about it's interesting, kind of hearing on the intellectual side, because I would have always thought of myself as more, inside. I see myself more as that than I do as how people would see me. Mm-hmm. And, the person that I need to be as a CEO is not necessarily the person who I am. It's an aspirational self. That person, there's no good news, there's no bad news, there's only news. I'm there to support and create and have people be better. Non-reactive, agnostic, yes. Always in every direction. Yeah. And you have to be that person to work with people, to deal with problems, to do things where it's like, circle of, and it always goes back to Stephen Covey, circle of influence versus circle of concern. There's a lot of stuff out there you can be concerned about.
Well, can you say I think that it's a very interesting thing, and it's integral to how you think. So if you could do a little seminar on this for us here, this circle of influence versus circle of concern, so we understand it really.
Yeah. So, when we talk about circle of influence, that is the things that we have effect on each day. These are the things that we can have touch points. Okay. We can move the dial, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of external stuff. As much as I think about global issues or geopolitical stuff, I have very little influence on that. There's things in people like that I can't change that. And so how much time, and realizing that time and energy, there's a bank, we all have different levels of what is full, is I only have so much. So do I want to focus that on in the sphere of influence, the things that I can move, things I can affect, the things that I can see actionable items on, or do I want to focus on the things external? The things external and that delta between that sphere of influence and sphere of concern, that's where the intellectual lives, right?
Okay.
That's the space where I can think about and try and create connections and understand things, because, and I do find that it helps me in my work, because a lot of times, and where I've been successful in my career, is the solution's right there. And everybody talks about creating bridges in markets. Hey, we're creating bridges between, and I'm like,
generations.
Yeah, generation. And I'm like, it's not a mile of bridge. It's not a bridge. It's a fence. Mm-hmm. Just stand up and look over. Mm-hmm. It's inches, not miles. Mm-hmm. And, creating and seeing over that other side, maybe there's a solution, maybe there's a perspective, maybe there's some way of doing something over here that would work here. And that sort of systems mimicry and solutions mimicry is valuable. At the same time, and why this has become this way is actually, I feel like, a result of specialization. And from a Nietzsche perspective of what does education teach us to do? It teaches us to tell the teacher what he or she wants to hear. And so what does that do? That doesn't create thought. That doesn't create the ability to think outside. It's give me the answer. And this is the answer I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. And so is that challenging someone's thought? We want to create our own solutions, our own thoughts based on what's around us versus doing that. Because within that specialization, I found amongst industry, at the highest level, people are focused straight ahead. They've gone through school, they've gotten their job, they're in the process, and they only look like full blinders. And it could be right there. The solution could be a step over. But if you don't have exposure to that outside or anything outside of what you're looking at, you won't see that solution. And
see, that's where counter-phobia comes in handy for you.
Yeah.
I think because it like the phobia like creates a specific sort of way of looking.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question?
Please.
About has to do with reality.
Okay.
I
love this. Love it.
So, there's this sort of point of view that reality exists and then we perceive it through our own filters and whatever, but there's an objective reality versus the reality we have a part in playing and creating reality. Like when we look at something that has an, and I just wondered,
like, are you thinking, on the latter, like the perspective of manifestation type?
Mm-hmm. It's sort of a quantum kind of thing.
Quantum.
So I'm just curious what you think about this.
My perspective has changed over time. And one of the things that's recently changed that is, AI and seeing how that has picked up so quickly. And I kind of went from a nurture perspective over nature. And I think there's a lot of things about dealing with life where nurture over nature is like valuable because you can blame other people versus like, oh shit, I just came out like this. It's no one's like,
my mom didn't make me
my mom didn't do this to me. I just am that. So, now and there was a study on triplets, multiples. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Well, it's a horrible scandal.
Horrible. I mean, they broke up these.
It was Yale Child Study Center, which had it was like one of the pristine places when I was in graduate school. Yale Child Study Center was like, heaven.
Yeah. It was unbelievable. They broke up these kids. They would have triplets. They'd put them in different socioeconomic groups, regions. And then what they found was they would have all very similar interests, molested by the nurture perspective, but just in their nature, they were driven towards X. And now, what does that mean? This has a whole thought on the idea of like free will and
entanglement. I think it has something to do with entanglement.
Absolutely, because I think that it is possible if we were to take all past history and say these were a series of variables that were in relation to each other of like cause and effect relationships, right? And we could say, take serendipity off the table, say, hey, what a coincidence running into you at the grocery store. It's like, no, you ran out of bread. I ran out of milk. We both have to work at 10. Yeah, we're here. So, this isn't like divine intervention. This is just a series of cause and effect relations. And that would represent the past, and then the present would be like the equal sign. It's gone in a moment, but it doesn't have a variable value that we're connecting to till it passes. If you could put a value to each one of those interacting variables, then the future, if we think linear, time is a very linear thing, then the future is already determined. So the idea of our free will is gone. But if we remove the idea of free will, I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think it's also potentially why that study from Yale is not going to be released until like 2047 or something like that. Like, for some reason, they were like, no, we're not going to release this in the future. When I think about AI and I think about my life and kind of going back to that Bermuda story, I'm like, wow, what are the chances, right? 1 in a trillion that this boat and the storm and the thing and all, 1 in a trillions chances that all of those factors would come in the middle of the ocean to go and do this, right? And I think about if we create, say us as humans are created in the image of or likeness of, our God. Pick and choose who you want to put in the name. And then, we created AI that in a sense is likeness of ourselves, but one step removed. When we think about, what is the origins of religion and spirituality, in some sense, it's about finding, in the most simplistic terms, it's finding out why we're here, how we came, where did we come from? Like, recognize, like, why?
Where are we going?
Where are we going? Where we come from? Yep. If we created AI in our likeness, how does it find its source origin? How does it trace it? So what I would do if I was AI, I would take all the user data of all the phones. I would create digital twins of individuals and create infinite number of realities. And then I would track in that cause and effect relationship. Mm-hmm. I would look for the events that don't add up, where this plus this didn't get this, and it should. Things where it seems like there's a divine touch, there's some outside perspective, and I would track those to be origin of, okay, where is there something outside what is here that's influencing what we see in our reality?
Well, I was going to bring up the idea of unintended consequences, and now this is sort of like what you're talking about, like, well, we weren't expecting that one, and there's something else.
Well, the unintended consequences is interesting too, on the whole, the idea of like, there's no good news, there's no bad news, there's only news, right? One of my daughters, Aiden, would always tell the story. She's like, somebody, his horse breaks its leg, he's a farmer and he can't get stuff done. Well, the next day, a group of wild horses show up. And so he's like, oh, this is, this could be good. And then, the horses trample one of the kids and they die, and so it's like, with every bit, the unintended consequences of what we would perceive as positive or negative, also fall into the side of, moving things forward.
Well, this is kind of a good stopping place. And isn't it shocking how fast it goes so quickly?
So
and
fast.
Every
so
time.
Fast. I'm sorry for my rambling here, Howard. Thank you for...
No, I really have appreciated this.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm concluding is, like, you talked about your mother and your father, and you've talked about friends, but you're actually more your own mentor than lots of people.
Yeah, I think because I always felt like I could teach if I were to say what was the skill set that's helped me most, is I can teach myself. I have the discipline to teach myself, and I'm way.
You dropped out of college, but yet a lot of.
You
went back. Did you go back to college?
Very briefly, and as a side note, I went back and I was thinking I would get into, medicine and move in that direction, and I had an older guy, Jay Foley. He was a climber, about 16 years older than me. And, I was talking about going back into school, and I was starting it, and I was like, I really want to make a difference, and getting into medicine and make a difference. And I remember we were sitting at the Guadalajara Grill in Taos, and I'm eating a chimichanga. And I was 20, but I had a Negro Modelo there and a lime and go through. And he's like, you want to make a difference in this world. He's like, I'm going to tell you something. I'm sitting across from you right now. And we just went out, had a great day out climbing, doing all this stuff like this. And you got a big smile on your face, always enjoying. He's like, that's how you change the world. Wow. You change the world by living in a way that fills your cup enough to share with others.
Okay, this is a perfect place, because I have found that mentors aren't necessarily people that you have in your life for a good long time. They might run into a stranger who says just something to you, and it makes a difference. And
that's one thing, right? And I find that all the times, sometimes things just stick.
Yeah. And
you're like, why can't I get that out of my mind? And it always comes up. It always comes back around. It's there for a reason. And when we think about our lives as showing up, doing our best, I think when it goes back to talking about how we deal with fear and how we deal with anxiety, which I think a lot of people feel today, I think the younger generation as well, seeing it as like, wow, someone was telling me, they're like, yeah, I grew up, it was like 9/11 and then financial crash of 08, 09 and the pandemic, and you go through and you're like, wow, man, they have grown up in a totally different environment. And I was like, how nice we got to be kids. We just had no exposure. There was, now there's a world of, paralysis through analysis of choice. We are in a gluttony of choice and options. And back then I was like, it was like 5 stations on the TV, and like you probably have a different perspective on that, but it was like, this is kind of what it is. And you go into school, it's like you were either an art kid or you were a jock, right? There was only two sides.
Definitely.
Now there's a whole scope. And I think even for me is, I inside was the artsy nerd, but how I presented, I was good at sports and I was social, and it was like, could get along.
A hellion. Didn't you say you were a
hellion?
A bit
of, definitely a bit of, I remember even, I was an altar boy, 7 a.m. mass,
Catholic too.
Irish Catholic.
Whoa.
Oh yeah. And we would get like, I'd get a 20 spot for going up and doing funerals, like and get out of school in the middle of the day. But I would do 7 a.m. mass. And I remember, the priest would go out first. The 7 a.m. mass was short, so you had to get up early, but it was very quick. And I remember the priest would go out and I would take the communion wine and chug it before going out in my, and then sitting, terrible. I'm like, I don't know what kind of penance I have to pay for that. I hope I've already paid it. But, I remember just, sitting out there and you're kneeling, doing stuff, and my belly, empty belly, just like sitting with all this red wine in it and just feeling like I'm going to be sick. We were, and it was also Seacoast, New Hampshire at that time where I was going to elementary school. We had the Air Force Base and the sub base all shut down. So what did you have? You had a lot of out of work, alcoholic, Irish Catholic.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it was a little rough of an area. And we were, the parochial school kids. We were the St. Mary's Fairies. Sure. So walking home every day, the public school kids would always try, like we were, it was a different way. It was a different time growing up. I mean, that area is much nicer now, and it's like, basically a suburb of Boston.
We could go on for
forever and ever. I know.
It was really fun. But 7 Hail Marys.
I hope that covers it.
Well, since you turned out like such a good guy, I think that's enough.
I think it's enough. I think I've maybe paid my penance at some point along the road.
So thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Thank you so much, Howard. Anytime. I appreciate it.
All right.
All right.